Hello, everyone. My name's Anna Schultz. I'm a senior biology major, and my topic for today's discussion is the conservation of African elephants, Loxodonta africana, with the use of infrasound. So I originally found this topic because of my interest in elephants. I've always been fascinated them and with animal behavior, and I wanted to learn more. So with the guidance of Dr. Bobby, I was able to find the topic of infrasound. So a little overview of what we'll be talking about today is we'll be addressing elephant behavior and their communication abilities. And we'll also be understanding infrasound complexity, like what it is and the multiple sensory channels that elephants use, their acoustic structure and strategies that are employed by elephants, and how this all affects the group's behavior. Also, the uses of infrasound measurement and interpretation in regards to conservation are important for the study that we'll be looking at, where infrasound can be used to measure stress. For elephant behavior and communication, there's a lot about elephant communication that we still don't know, but it's thought that elephants' ability to communicate with each other is the reason why they have increased brain capabilities. And they're extremely social animals with tight family groups that are led by a matriarch. So they employ multisensory monitoring of their families as well as their surroundings. One study that was done in 2013 describes how sound, more so than other senses, became the most developed in elephants centuries ago because they were living in the forest where sight and smell are less valuable to survival. But low frequency sounds like infrasound were useful when they were in the trees. So they use sound for communication, but they also use it for reproduction. They're able to use different calls to determine what males are in the area and which females are in estrus, which is their version of being in heat. And it also provides safety against predators and allows them to do resource location. So in that same study from 2013, researchers were testing the theory that elephants could even sense where lightning storms were going to occur so that they could move their herds away from the danger. And they found that elephants could hear the low frequency infrasounds coming from the storms and interpret this as information, even though it came from an abiotic source. So they're able to gather this information from biotic and abiotic sources. And they also found that elephants move differently during wet and dry seasons from this study. The issue with the constant movements, though, of the herds of African elephants is that they share land and resources with human villages, and this causes human-elephant conflict between conservation efforts and the villagers who don't want their crops damaged. And this is also one of the main reasons for the study we'll be looking at today with the use of infrasound. So what is infrasound? Well, it's characterized by low frequency sound, which is anything less than about 20 hertz, and it's lower than humans can audibly register. So it's not the trumpet calls that we hear from elephants usually, it's the rumbles that they hear between themselves. And it's also used by animals like whales and alligators, but it can be generated by abiotic sources like storms. It also allows for communication over several kilometers. So it's important for the elephants because they're able to locate other herds and also coordinate movements of their entire group. So in the study that we'll be looking at, this communication comes in the form of inaudible rumbles, which is why infrasound was the chosen vocalization to be studied. So why do we care about elephants and the way that they use infrasound? Well, in 1960, the elephant population in Africa was estimated at 3 to 4 million and now stands around 500,000. The African elephant is now an endangered species due to ivory poaching and habitat loss due to overgrazing as they travel in such large groups. And in these areas, especially in South Africa, wildlife managers have resorted to managing African elephant populations by culling the adults, so killing them off and then selling the calves. They also do contraception with the female elephants or translocation of elephants because of their negative impact on the agriculture for the humans they're cohabiting with. And translocation is just where they take the elephants and move them somewhere else. With an increased understanding of how elephants communicate, we may be able to better conserve their species. So, as I mentioned before, one of the tactics being employed to manage elephant populations is translocation. So Joshua Viljoen and his group did their study in 2014 in Kruger National Park, South Africa. And they focused on translocation because culling, selling, contraception are all very invasive. So they wanted to focus on translocation as the non-invasive tactic of managing elephant populations. So this study was published in Bioacoustics in 2014. And here on the right, you can see a map of South Africa and where Kruger National Park lies. So the purpose of this study was to quantify the stress response of elephants in order to better conservation efforts. And their hypothesis was that vocalizations can be used to measure stress after translocation. And this is just a side note, but one of the important names in this paper is William Langbauer, who was a part of this research team. William Langbauer, he is important because he's done several studies on elephant behavior and their use of infrasound, and his work was cited in almost every primary literature source that I looked at. So the methods for this paper, the study was taken place over 3.5 years in Kruger National Park, and the group chose a family of 11 elephants to follow and record. So they did this by fitting the matriarch with a GPS collar and recording the vocalizations of the group. And they were able to compile pre, during, and post translocation data for vocalizations. And they did this by following the group on foot at a distance of 20 to 120 meters away with condenser microphones and a windshield with fur covers to decrease unwanted sounds like wind and things like that. And they recorded the group as a whole and not as individuals because they felt that it would make the data more complicated to try to figure out which sounds were coming from which elephants. So instead, they just recorded the entire group. So at the same time, they were also taking fecal samples while they were following the group. So they measured fecal glucocorticoid metabolite, and we'll call that FGM in this talk. And this shows where there was a physiological response to stress of being in an unfamiliar place because FGM is known to indicate a change in emotion or excitement. FGM is an indicator of adrenal activity and has been used as a measure of stress in a number of other studies. So data was collected for months before translocation as a baseline, then during translocation for the 23 days it took the elephants to find their way back, and also for months after the elephants had returned to their original area to see if the effects of stress lingered. Then to ensure that there was less researcher bias, the audio recordings were assigned a random code and played in no particular order to make sure that only the data in each recording was what was being interpreted and not the circumstances. So here's our first figure, and this is a map of Kruger National Park. And we see down here, this elephant on the bottom is the capture site, and the elephant up here is the release site. So the distance between the capture site and the release site was about 300 kilometers. so about 186.4 miles. And the elephants were recorded and monitored at the capture site. They were anesthetized or drugged and then taken to the release site where they were dropped off and then given the reversal of the drug so that they could wake up and then find their way back. And they were followed on foot until they got back to the capture site, but they were not helped at all by the researchers to find their way. And it took them 23 days total to return. So for our next figure, just to orient us, we have fundamental frequency in hertz on the left. And the reason why fundamental frequency was used was because fundamental frequency is the strongest audible pitch, whereas other measures of sound like harmonics would not be as strong. And then on the right, we have fecal glucocorticoid metabolite, and that was measured in wet weight. And then each of our parts of this graph are organized in columns. So this column here is pre-translocation. The next column is translocation, and the last column is post-translocation. So this is a box plot for the vocalization frequencies that were recorded and the FGM levels that were measured for pre, during, and post-translocation. Here, the light gray boxes indicate vocal frequency and the dark gray boxes indicate FGM levels. And the diamonds in each of the boxes indicate the mean value for each, and the whiskers indicate the minimum and maximum values that were recorded. So if we only concentrate on the light gray boxes first, these, we see a trend where the frequency of calls started around 14 hertz here, and then it increased to about 16 or 17 hertz during translocation, and then decreased but stayed slightly elevated at almost 15 hertz in post-translocation. Now, all of these were considered infrasound as it was under 20 hertz. And the researchers found this change to be statistically significant. I would equate this trend to be comparable to when humans are under stress and our voices tend to go into a higher register because we're anxious or we're nervous. And what's interesting is that the frequency of calls and rumbles stayed elevated when comparing post-translocation to pre-translocation. Now, if we look at the dark gray boxes for FGM levels, we see a similar trend where the translocation samples contain the highest levels of FGM, and post-translocation levels remained elevated in comparison to pre-translocation levels. Researchers found this data, when compared to each other, was statistically significant by using two statistical analyses, and found that the only data not statistically significant was when post-translocation and pre-translocation of FGM was compared. Now, in our next figure, we're looking at the frequencies of infrasound vocalizations over the several months that this study was done across. So on the x-axis, we have our dates, and on the y, we have our fundamental frequency again. The structure of this graph is similar to the previous graph where pre, during, and post-translocation are shown in separate columns. So here we have pre, in the gray we have during, and then this is our post. So starting from the top to the bottom, these values on this line are the higher frequency vocalizations that were picked out and not interpreted because they were above 30 hertz and did not fall into the category of infrasound. These would be vocalizations like trumpet sounds that we are used to hearing from elephants. The size of each black dot also indicates the amount of occurrences recorded at that frequency. So the bigger the dot, the more vocalizations were recorded at that frequency on that day. So starting at the leftmost data points, they're more organized and tightly correlated than the data we see across the graph. This is the data taken from pre-translocation, and the recordings range from about 12 hertz to about 17 hertz. The gray column is labeled translocation and looks to have more disorganized vocalizations. It's not as tight as the pre-translocation vocalizations. And these vocalizations range from 12 hertz to about 20 hertz, so slightly higher. And the researchers interpreted that there was an overall increase in vocal register over each day during translocation. The third column of data here is for the post-translocation data, and it's much more disorganized compared to the pre-translocation data, but the data points stay at about the same range as during translocation. This supports the findings in the previous graph that showed that post-translocation vocalizations remained elevated even after the elephants found their way back home. So as a review, when the vocalization data and FGM data were all compared against each other, all data was statistically significant with the exception of comparing pre and post-translocation FGM levels. So this indicates that there's a relationship between the change in vocal stress and FGM levels and the stress put on elephants by being moved to an unknown location and using infrasound to find their way back. Also, vocal stress and FGM levels stayed elevated even upon arrival back to their home. Researchers said this may be due to residual stress after being drugged and dropped off in a random place. Researchers did also mention that this stress is not an indication of specific emotions that are felt by the elephants. Like, it's not saying that they were scared or happy, but instead it should just be looked at as a stress stimulus in general. And the researchers also mentioned that there could be more than one reason for this increase in vocalization frequency, such as the younger calves being more vocal as their voices would be in a higher register, or predators being close by, because they did say that there were a couple times that they encountered a few predators on the way back. And overall, researchers found this method of translocation to be more non-invasive than any other means of population control, and stated that further research would be needed in order to use this information to create better technologies that would help with elephant conservation. There were a few related studies that were relevant, and these related studies either used Langbauer's work, as I mentioned before, or could be used to support this study. And they addressed topics like elephants' response to different types of elephant calls at varying distances. So they were able to interpret different calls as different types of communication. There's also one about antiphonal vocal bouts, which is the exchange of calls between elephants, like they're having a conversation. There was the one that I talked about before, the detection of lightning storms, characterizing vocalizations like differentiating between rumbles, trumpets, and other types of vocalization, trying to interpret what exactly they mean. And there was this really interesting study from 2018 that applies to this topic that was looking at the use of sound probes to detect the infrasound coming from elephants that could be used to accurately locate and redirect elephants that are approaching villages. So I didn't talk about that study, as interesting as it is. I didn't talk about it as much because it is in the preliminary phases of trials, but they were trying to come up with a technology to factor in how wind, temperature, all of that can change the infrasound that comes from elephants. And they were trying to use probes that would accurately locate the elephants so that they could go out before they make it to the village and redirect them. So I thought that was really interesting. So the major takeaways are that infrasound is uniquely necessary for animals like elephants who utilize sound more than any other sense. And it also allows them to locate each other and detect dangers as well as successfully reproduce. Also, measuring vocalizations could lead to better conservation efforts. Understanding how these animals communicate can help wildlife management to develop methods other than culling and contraception to deter elephant groups from crossing into villages. With these findings and the developments of the other studies and technologies, we can look to more non-invasive methods of conservation for the future. Thank you for coming to my talk and have a good day.